Hey guys, tonight we delve deep into the flickering gaslight of the Victorian era, a time not just of corsets and colonialism, but of a quiet, pervasive epidemic, sleeplessness. Imagine the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestones, the distant cry of a night watchman, the suffocating closeness of a coal-fire-heated room, and you, lying wide awake, staring into the oppressive darkness. The silence of your bedchamber is a drum, amplifying every tick of the grandfather clock, every creak of the floorboards, every worry that dances just beyond the reach of slumber. If you were actually transported back to a typical Victorian bedroom with their understanding of medicine and hygiene, you probably wouldn't survive the night, let alone get any sleep from anxiety about, well, everything. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment down below with where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see our global community of night owls and history buffs. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself enveloped not just by heavy velvet curtains, but by a palpable sense of nocturnal anxiety. The very air in your Victorian room feels thick, a cocktail of coal smoke from the fireplace that's now just embers. The lingering scent of last night's mutton, and perhaps a faint whiff of the not-so-sanitary conditions of the bustling city outside your window. True darkness, the kind we might seek for perfect sleep, is an elusive luxury. Gas lamps line the streets below, casting an unsettling, flickering orange glow that seeps through any gap in your window coverings, painting dancing shadows on the wall that your tired mind might twist into all sorts of unsettling shapes. It's a far cry from the gentle glow of a phone screen, though perhaps just as effective at keeping you wired. The sounds are another matter entirely. The city doesn't truly sleep, not in the way a countryside village might. You hear the rumble of early morning carts already heading to market, their iron-shod wheels a thunderous announcement on the uneven cobblestones. A dog barks incessantly a few streets over. Perhaps a neighbor, equally sleepless, coughs a deep, chesty cough that seems to echo through the thin walls. And then there are the human sounds, arguments spilling out from a nearby pub, the mournful song of someone wandering home after a few too many, or the sharp cry of a baby. It's a symphony of urban disquiet, a constant reminder of the teeming, restless life just beyond your door. You pull the covers higher, perhaps a dozen layers of heavy linen, wool, and maybe even a quilt that feels like it weighs as much as a small child. Trying to get comfortable is an expedition in itself. This struggle for sleep isn't just your personal torment. It's a creeping malady of the age. The Victorian era, spanning from roughly 1837 to 1901, was a period of unprecedented change. The Industrial Revolution had shifted populations from the relative quiet of agrarian life to the relentless, grinding pace of the cities. Factories belched smoke and demanded long hours, and the pace of innovation and commerce brought with it a new kind of mental fatigue. For the burgeoning middle class, there were the pressures of maintaining appearances, of rigid social etiquette, of constant striving. For the working poor, exhaustion was a given. But the kind of bone-deep weariness that still somehow fought off true, restorative slumber. The very concept of nerves seemed to take on a life of its own during this period. You hear whispers about neurasthenia, a fashionable diagnosis that encompassed a whole constellation of symptoms: fatigue, anxiety, headaches, irritability, and, of course, stubborn insomnia. Doctors were beginning to pay more attention to these complaints, though their understanding was often filtered through the lens of the era's moral and social biases. Historians still argue whether the epidemic of nervousness, often linked to insomnia, was a genuine medical crisis driven by societal change or, in part, a cultural construct. A way for people to articulate the stresses of a rapidly transforming world. Perhaps it was a bit of both. Imagine the newspapers and pamphlets of the day. alongside advertisements for miraculous hair restorers and corsets guaranteed to give you the perfect wasp waist. You'd find an increasing number of ads for sleep aids, for tonics to calm the agitated mind. Insomnia wasn't just a personal failing. It was becoming a public concern, a recognized ailment that people were desperate to solve. It's quite telling that a society so obsessed with progress and industry was also so deeply preoccupied with the inability to switch off. They could build magnificent bridges and lay transatlantic cables, but they couldn't always conquer the simple human need for a good night's rest. It's a bit like us with our smartphones, isn't it? All the information in the world at our fingertips, but sometimes the off switch is the hardest button to find. Even the orientation of your bed might come under scrutiny. Some popular theories, drifting into the realm of the slightly peculiar, suggested that the direction you slept in mattered. There was a quirky, though surprisingly persistent, tidbit of advice circulating. Never sleep with your head pointing north. It was believed this could interfere with your body's natural, animal magnetism, disrupting its delicate electrical balance and thus, your sleep. South was generally preferred, though east wasn't too bad either. West, however, was sometimes considered just as problematic as north. You might find yourself meticulously rearranging your heavy oak bedstead, hoping this simple change might be the key, only to find the same anxieties waiting for you when you lay your head on the bolster. The anxieties themselves are a heavy blanket. Worries about health are paramount, or any number of other ailments that doctors had few effective treatments for. Financial worries gnaw. The pressure to maintain one's station, or to simply survive, weighs heavily. Then there are the social anxieties, the slights perceived, the faux pas committed, replayed endlessly in the theater of the tired mind. It's a fertile ground for rumination, this pre-dawn quiet. You yearn for the oblivion of sleep, but your brain, it seems, has other plans, perhaps plotting its next great Victorian novel. At least with insomnia, you are still, broadly speaking, alive. So you lie there, in the heart of the 19th century, acutely aware of the world churning around you and the turmoil churning within. In our journey, we'll explore just what they turned to when the counting of sheep, or perhaps the counting of newfangled steam engines, simply wasn't enough. As you lie there, wrestling with the anxieties of the age we just spoke of, your attention might naturally turn to the very room you're in, the immediate environment you hope will coax you into unconsciousness. Before even considering potions or contraptions, the Victorian insomniac, or indeed anyone hoping for a healthy night's rest, would have very specific ideas about what made a bedroom conducive to sleep, and perhaps more importantly, what made it dangerous. And one of the most pervasive, deeply ingrained anxieties centered on something you might find surprising: the air itself, specifically the night air. You might instinctively want to crack a window to let in a cool breeze. But in the Victorian mindset, that would be an act of sheer folly, akin to inviting trouble or even illness directly into your sanctuary. Remember those heavy velvet curtains we mentioned? They weren't just for blocking out the unsettling glow of the gaslights or prying eyes. They were a crucial line of defense. Your windows are likely firmly shut, perhaps even latched. And if you're particularly cautious, you might have stuffed fabric snakes along the bottom of the door to block any insidious drafts. The aim is to make your bedroom as airtight as possible, a sealed box against the perceived perils lurking in the darkness outside. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? We now champion fresh air and ventilation for good sleep, while you, in your 19th century bed, are essentially trying to create a hermetically sealed tomb of slumber, or, as is often the case, non-slumber. This profound fear of night air wasn't just some quaint superstition. It was rooted in the dominant medical understanding of disease transmission for much of the era, the miasma theory, before germ theory. Championed by figures like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch later in the century, fully took hold. It was widely believed that diseases like cholera, typhoid, and even the common cold were spread by miasmas, noxious, invisible vapors or mists emanating from decaying organic matter stagnant water, and generally unsanitary places. And night, with its dampness and darkness, was considered prime time for these dangerous effluvia to rise and travel. So, that cool night breeze you might crave? To the Victorian mind, it could be carrying all sorts of microscopic malevolence straight into your lungs. One can only imagine the delightful aroma inside some of these meticulously sealed rooms. A rich bouquet of eau de old socks, stale breath, and a general lack of circulation. Delightful. Think about the typical Victorian city, bustling, often overcrowded, with sanitation systems that were, shall we say, a work in progress. The River Thames, for instance, was notoriously polluted for a significant portion of the century, leading to events like the Great Stink of 1858, where the smell was so overwhelming it even disrupted Parliament. With such potent sources of foul air around, it's perhaps understandable why people were so keen to keep their windows shut tight, especially after dark when the miasmas were thought to be at their most active and virulent. The logic was simple. Bad smells equal bad air, and bad air equal disease. Therefore, seal your home, especially your sleeping quarters where you are most vulnerable, against the invisible atmospheric threat. This belief permeated every level of society. Medical advice columns in newspapers and popular health manuals would sternly warn against the dangers of night air. Florence Nightingale herself, a figure revered for her contributions to nursing and sanitation, was a staunch believer in fresh air during the day for patients. But even she acknowledged the prevailing anxieties about night air, though she worked to reform hospital ventilation overall. Historians still argue whether the stubborn adherence to miasma theory significantly hampered public health advancements despite growing empirical evidence against it in other areas. It's a complex picture, as improvements in sanitation did often reduce disease, which, perversely, sometimes reinforced the idea that the bad smells, miasmas, being removed were the cause, rather than the microscopic organisms thriving in the filth. So, you lie in your stuffy room, the air growing heavier with each passing hour. The fireplace, which earlier might have offered some ventilation along with its warmth from that coal fire we imagined, is now likely a source of soot and a dwindling oxygen supply rather than a comfort. Any attempt at cross-ventilation would be seen as reckless. This means the carbon dioxide you exhale, along with any other airborne particles from bedding, candles, or oil lamps, simply accumulates. It's a wonder anyone got any restful sleep at all, given the potential for headaches and general grogginess from the poor air quality alone. Perhaps some of that famed Victorian nervousness was simply chronic, low-level asphyxiation. A bit of a stretch, maybe, but the air quality certainly didn't help. Beyond the mainstream medical fear of miasma, there were other, more folkloric beliefs that contributed to the dread of the open window after dark. In some rural communities, or lingering from older traditions, there was a quirky and rather unsettling tidbit of folk wisdom. The idea that night air could carry the breath of the dead, or even allow malevolent spirits or night hags to enter the home and torment sleepers, perhaps even sit on their chests, causing nightmares or a feeling of suffocation. Imagine hearing that bedtime story as a child. You'd probably barricade your window with your toy soldiers. While educated urban Victorians might publicly dismiss such notions as peasant superstition, these underlying anxieties about the unseen and the unknown often have a way of subtly reinforcing more scientific fears. If modern parents adopted Victorian childcare advice regarding fresh air for infants, there'd likely be a global shortage of smelling salts. For the parents, that is. The efforts to keep night air out could be quite elaborate. Wealthier homes might have inner shutters in addition to heavy curtains. Windows would be meticulously checked for cracks or gaps. Some even believe that certain plants near the home released noxious vapors at night, so garden planning could be influenced by these concerns. It all adds up to an environment that is, by our standards, incredibly claustrophobic. You're essentially marinating in your own expelled breath and whatever delightful particles are emanating from the chamber pot tucked discreetly in the corner. This fear of the night air, this obsession with sealing oneself in, directly contradicts what we now know helps us sleep: a cool, well-ventilated room. It's a potent reminder of how dramatically our understanding of health and the environment can change. As you lie there, perhaps feeling a bead of sweat trickle down your temple in the close atmosphere, you might begin to understand why escaping into unconsciousness was such a profound desire, and why. If simply controlling your immediate environment didn't work, you'd soon be looking for more active interventions. The path to slumber was fraught with perceived dangers, even from the very air you needed to breathe. The irony is, in trying to protect themselves from one set of imagined threats, they may have inadvertently created conditions that made restful sleep even harder to achieve. So, you've ensured your Victorian bedchamber is as airtight as a pharaoh's tomb. Remember, to keep out that dreaded night air we just discussed. You're lying there in the stuffy warmth, the silence punctuated only by the distant city hum and perhaps the frantic beating of your own heart, still seeking that elusive sleep. Having addressed the invisible atmospheric threats, your mind, or perhaps the advice of your local physician, might turn inwards to what you've consumed. Because in the Victorian understanding of health and well-being, diet, especially the evening meal, played a starring role in the nightly drama of wakefulness. If the air outside was a villain, then what you put on your plate just hours before bed could be an equally disruptive character. Picture the typical late evening scene in a middle or upper-class Victorian household. Supper, often served quite late, perhaps 8 or even 9 o'clock, wasn't usually a light affair. We're not talking about a modest bowl of soup and a piece of fruit here. Oh no. Think multiple courses, rich sauces, and a heavy reliance on meat. Publications like the incredibly popular Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in 1861, paint a vivid picture of these meals. You might have started with a hearty soup, followed by a substantial fish course, then perhaps a roast, beef, mutton, or game birds, accompanied by an array of gravies, potatoes, and other, often heavily cooked, vegetables. And let's not forget dessert: suet puddings, trifles laden with cream, fruit tarts with thick pastry. It's the kind of meal that could, quite frankly, tranquilize a small bear, or at least make it deeply regret its life choices for a few hours. The prevailing wisdom about how such a feast interacted with sleep was somewhat contradictory, as these things often are. On one hand, a very full stomach was thought by some to induce a certain torpor, drawing blood and energy to the digestive system and away from an overactive brain, thus encouraging sleep. You can almost imagine a portly gentleman, waistcoat buttons straining, sinking into his armchair by the fire after such a meal, a gentle snooze practically guaranteed. However, for many, and perhaps for you as you lie there feeling a bit overstuffed, this culinary indulgence was a direct path to nocturnal misery. Indigestion, or dyspepsia, as it was commonly called, was a national complaint, a constant companion to many Victorians, and it was widely blamed for interfering with sleep. That heavy, undigested meal could sit like a lead weight in your stomach, leading to heartburn, bloating, and a general sense of discomfort that made lying down, let alone sleeping, a real challenge. You might find yourself propped up on extra pillows, trying to find an angle that doesn't encourage the contents of your stomach to stage a rebellion. The Victorians were quite familiar with this sensation, and the market was awash with remedies for indigestion. Bicarbonate of soda was a common go-to, as were various chalky powders and effervescent salts, all promising to quell the internal uprising. It's a familiar modern complaint too, isn't it? Eating a massive curry too close to bedtime rarely ends well for our 21st century sleep cycles either. The Victorians were just doing it with more layers of clothing and, arguably, more elaborate sauces. The connection between diet and dreams, or rather nightmares, was also a strong belief. Certain foods were notorious for their alleged ability to provoke unsettling nocturnal visions. One quirky but widely held tidbit was the fear of eating cheese before bed, especially strong, aged varieties like Stilton or potent cheddar, while some hardy souls might include a sliver with a glass of port as a nightcap. Many others swore it was a one-way ticket to a night filled with ghouls, goblins, and perhaps even a spectral visitation from your disapproving Aunt Agatha. Other culprits for repeating on you and causing wakefulness or bad dreams included onions, cucumbers, and particularly rich or spicy dishes. It's amusing to think of learned Victorian gentlemen seriously discussing the nightmare-inducing properties of a bit of toasted cheese, but these were genuine concerns. Their dietary advice for sleep was often based less on rigorous science and more on a kind of anecdotal evidence that my Uncle Albert ate a whole pork pie and didn't sleep a wink for 3 days. So clearly pork pies cause insomnia school of thought. Historians still argue whether the Victorian preoccupation with indigestion as a primary cause of ill health, including insomnia, reflected genuine dietary issues stemming from their rich, often unbalanced diets, or if it was, in part, a broader cultural anxiety about bodily functions and the desire for internal order and control. In an age striving for outward propriety and discipline, perhaps internal chaos, even if it was just a rumbling stomach, was particularly unsettling. Whatever the root, the effect was clear. Many sleepless nights were blamed on the evening meal. So, what was a restless Victorian to do? The advice, as you might expect, varied. Some physicians advocated for very light suppers, a thin gruel, a piece of toast, perhaps a little milk. Others suggested that a small, easily digestible but nonetheless nourishing meal was best to prevent hunger pangs from waking you in the small hours. Then there were those who, perhaps recalling the soporific effect on that portly gentleman, suggested that a moderate, comforting meal could indeed be beneficial. You might find yourself experimenting. One night a Spartan repast that leaves you feeling hollow and still awake. The next a more substantial meal that leads to a night of symphonic snoring from your partner and your own existential dread about what breakfast might bring after such a culinary onslaught. You might also consider a nightcap in liquid form. While we'll delve into the more potent chemical assistants later, even non-alcoholic beverages were considered. Warm milk, perhaps with a little nutmeg, was a popular choice, as were various herbal infusions, a precursor to our modern sleepy time teas. But again, consistency was not the Victorian strong suit. Some nightcaps were decidedly not light, featuring eggs, cream, and plenty of sugar, practically another dessert course in a glass. You can almost feel your digestive system waving a tiny white flag of surrender. The connection between that heavy, late meal and the stuffy, sealed room we talked about earlier also creates a rather unfortunate synergy. A body working overtime to digest a large quantity of rich food naturally generates heat in a poorly ventilated space. This internal furnace effect would only add to the feeling of oppressive warmth and discomfort, making it even harder to drift off. It's a cycle of discomfort, where one well-intentioned but misguided habit exacerbates another. You're essentially trying to sleep in a warm, airtight oven, possibly marinating in your own gastric juices. Sweet dreams were probably not on the menu that night. As you lie there, contemplating the ghost of the suet pudding past, you realize that managing the Victorian night involves a delicate, and often unsuccessful, balancing act between environmental control and internal regulation. All right, so you've battled the dreaded night air, remember. Sealing yourself into your Victorian bedchamber like a precious, albeit slightly sweaty, relic. You've navigated the treacherous landscape of the heavy Victorian supper, hoping that neither too much nor too little food would be the key to unlocking the gates of slumber, a quest often ending in a symphony of indigestion we just explored. Yet, despite these valiant efforts, sleep remains a fickle mistress, always just out of reach. The anxieties of the age, the clatter of the city, the sheer discomfort of your meticulously prepared yet somehow still imperfect, sleeping environment, all conspire to keep your eyes resolutely open. When environmental tweaks and dietary diligence fail, the draw towards something more immediate, something with a more potent promise of oblivion, becomes almost irresistible. And in the Victorian pharmacopoeia, one substance above all others whispered such promises: laudanum. You've likely heard of it, perhaps in hushed tones or in connection with romantic poets and their tortured geniuses. Laudanum wasn't some rare, exotic concoction. It was an alcoholic tincture of opium, meaning opium dissolved in alcohol, and it was astonishingly, terrifyingly commonplace. You wouldn't need a doctor's note, a lengthy consultation, or a trip to a specialized pharmacy. Oh no. You could often procure laudanum from your local chemist, the grocer, sometimes even from traveling salesmen. It was, in many places, easier to get your hands on than a genuinely fresh loaf of bread, or perhaps even that decent cup of coffee we mentioned earlier. It was sold under its own name, or as a key ingredient in countless patent medicines, each claiming to cure a veritable encyclopedia of ailments. Its allure was undeniable, especially for the sleepless. A few drops, or perhaps a more generous swig, of this dark, bitter liquid could indeed bring a profound sense of calm, a detachment from your worries, and often a heavy, enveloping drowsiness. Imagine the relief after nights of tossing and turning, your mind a relentless carousel of thoughts. Laudanum offered a way to pull the emergency brake, to silence the noise both outside and inside your head. It was prescribed, or self-administered, for almost everything: coughs, colds, diarrhea, rheumatism, women's troubles, teething pain in infants, and, of course, that pervasive Victorian nervousness and its ever-present symptom, insomnia. Got a nagging toothache? Laudanum. Feeling a bit melancholic? Laudanum. Your pet rock seems listless? Well, maybe not the rock, but you get the sheer breadth of its application. The initial experience could feel like a warm wave washing over you. The anxieties that gripped you so tightly might loosen their hold. The physical discomforts, whether from indigestion from that rich supper or the aches of a laborious day, would recede into the background. For someone desperate for respite, laudanum must have seemed like a miracle, a true gift from the heavens, or at least from the nearest apothecary. Many prominent Victorians used it, from writers like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, whose experiences with opium are well documented, to countless ordinary individuals whose struggles were never recorded in literary history but were no less real. Some users even initially believed it enhanced their creativity or sharpened their insights, a rather romantic, if ultimately destructive, notion. But this dark lullaby came with a devastating price. Opium is, of course, highly addictive. The relief it offered was temporary, and soon, larger and more frequent doses were needed to achieve the same effect. Tolerance would build, and with it, the insidious chains of dependence. The very substance taken to soothe anxiety and induce sleep would eventually become a source of greater anxiety and profound disruption to natural sleep patterns when its effects wore off, or if attempts were made to stop. And then, to everyone's utter, complete, and total shock, or perhaps not so shocking in hindsight, people started to find it a bit too helpful, a bit too essential to their daily, or nightly, functioning. Withdrawal was, and is, a brutal experience: agonizing muscle cramps, vomiting, chills, fever, and an intensification of the very psychological distress the drug was meant to alleviate. Overdosing was also a constant and lethal risk, especially since the concentration of opium in laudanum preparations could vary wildly from one batch or one supplier to another. There were no strict manufacturing standards, no warning labels as we know them today, no real understanding for many users of just how dangerous this readily available medicine truly was. Some proprietary soothing syrups for babies, for example, which often contained opium, were marketed with benign and reassuring names like quietness or mother's friend. masking their potent and potentially lethal nature. A chilling thought when you consider the vulnerability of infants. Historians still argue whether the widespread societal acceptance of opium products in the 19th century was primarily due to a lack of effective medical alternatives for pain and distress, or if it pointed to a deeper cultural tendency towards self-medication as a way of coping with the immense stresses of a rapidly modernizing and often unforgiving world. Perhaps it was a complex interplay of both. When genuine medical understanding of many conditions, including chronic insomnia, was limited, and when life could be so harsh, the immediate, albeit deceptive, comfort offered by opium was a powerful temptation. So, as you lie there in your darkened room, perhaps contemplating that small, dark bottle on your bedside table, you are faced with a genuine dilemma. The promise of escape is potent. The silence it offers, even if artificial, is deeply craved. You might measure out the drops with a trembling hand. The bitter taste a familiar prelude to the anticipated mental quiet. For a while, it might even work. The worries might fade, the edges of consciousness might blur, and you might slip into a heavy, dreamless state that passes for sleep. But it's a Faustian bargain. The relief is borrowed, and the interest rates are impossibly high, often paid with your health, your autonomy, and sometimes your very life. The dark lullaby of laudanum, while it sang sweetly of rest to many a desperate Victorian, often led to a far more permanent and tragic silence. That potent and perilous substance we just explored looms large over the Victorian quest for sleep. Its dark lullaby, while initially so seductive, often led to a spiral of addiction and despair. As the 19th century wore on, and the devastating consequences of widespread opium use became harder to ignore, even if not fully understood by everyone, the search for other ways to calm those jangled Victorian nerves and coax the sleepless mind into surrender intensified. If laudanum was a well-intentioned demon, then surely, the thinking went, there must be a gentler, safer angel in the rapidly expanding world of chemistry. And for a time, it seemed that angel might have arrived in the form of a class of compounds known as bromides. You might picture yourself, wary now of the little brown bottle of laudanum, perhaps having witnessed its ill effects on a friend or family member. Or maybe just having read a cautionary article in one of the papers. You're still desperate for relief from those relentless nights spent staring at the ceiling. Your mind abuzz with the anxieties of your age. Your doctor, perhaps a forward-thinking fellow keen on the latest scientific advancements, might nod sympathetically and suggest a newer remedy. Something touted as effective for nervous excitement and less habit-forming than the opiates. He might prescribe potassium bromide, or perhaps sodium bromide. These salts, when dissolved in water, were gaining quite the reputation. Bromides entered the medical scene around the mid-1800s. Their rise to prominence began notably when an English physician, Sir Charles Locock, reported in 1857 that potassium bromide was effective in treating hysterical epilepsy, which we now understand as certain forms of epilepsy. This was a significant breakthrough for epilepsy treatment at the time. From there, its use quickly broadened. If it could calm the storm of an epileptic seizure, the reasoning went, surely it could soothe the more common tempests of anxiety, nervousness, and, crucially for you, insomnia. They were thought to work by depressing the central nervous system, reducing what doctors of the era called reflex excitability in the brain and spinal cord. Essentially, they were believed to turn down the volume on an overactive nervous system. Compared to the known dangers of opium, bromides were initially hailed as a much safer alternative. Safer, of course, can be a relative term. You might say a pillow fight is generally safer than wrestling a crocodile, but that doesn't make the pillow entirely harmless, especially if it's unexpectedly filled with, say, bricks. And so it was with bromides. They weren't opiates, which was a big plus. They didn't typically produce the same euphoric high, which was also seen as an advantage in preventing the kind of compulsive redosing associated with laudanum. For a while, They became the darlings of the medical establishment for treating a wide range of conditions linked to hyperexcitability. So, you might begin taking your prescribed bromide solution. It often had a distinctly salty or metallic taste, not exactly a delightful bedtime cordial. You might even joke it's like a refreshing gulp of, well, disappointment and future skin problems. Though you wouldn't know the latter part just yet. Initially, you might feel a sense of calm, a dulling of those sharp edges of anxiety. Sleep might come a little easier. Or you might feel a general sense of lethargy that could be mistaken for restful tranquility. For a population plagued by Victorian nervousness, this chemical dampening effect was often welcomed. Prescriptions for bromide preparations soared, and they became a staple in asylums, hospitals, and private homes alike. However, the angel had a hidden, rather unpleasant side. Bromides are cumulative toxins. They are eliminated from the body very slowly, so with regular use, the levels of bromide ions build up, leading to a condition known as bromism. The symptoms could be varied and insidious. At first, it might just be fatigue, drowsiness, and a general slowing of thought. But as toxicity increased, more severe problems would emerge. These included digestive upsets, a characteristic and often unpleasant acne-like skin rash known as bromide acne, muscle weakness, tremors, and significant psychological disturbances. Users could experience depression, irritability, confusion, memory loss, slurred speech, and even full-blown psychosis with hallucinations and delusions. Not exactly the picture of calm serenity you were hoping for. So, you might get some sleep. But you might also develop a rather fetching constellation of pustules and temporarily forget where you live. A fair trade? The Victorians, desperate for solutions, sometimes seemed to think so. Or at least, they weighed the risks differently. One of the more peculiar, and perhaps telling, quirky tidbits surrounding bromides was the belief, or rumor, that they significantly reduced sexual desire. This supposed anaphrodisiac quality led to them sometimes being administered, occasionally surreptitiously, in institutions like prisons, army barracks, or even some boarding schools, with the aim of maintaining order and suppressing undue excitement among the residents. Whether this was widespread practice or more of an urban legend is debated. But the fact that a sedative was also associated with dampening libido speaks volumes about the Victorian era's complex and often contradictory attitudes towards bodily urges and control. Historians still argue whether the medical community's initial and sustained enthusiasm for bromides, even as reports of their toxicity began to surface, was driven more by a genuine desperation for any alternative to opiates and any tool to manage severe neurological and psychiatric conditions, or whether commercial interests promoting these relatively new chemical compounds also played a significant role in their widespread adoption. Undoubtedly, there was a real need for effective sedatives. But the slowness to recognize and act upon the signs of chronic bromide poisoning is a sobering reminder of the limitations of medical knowledge and practice at the time. Despite these accumulating side effects, bromides remained in common use for decades, well into the 20th century, before being largely superseded by newer, though not always perfectly safe, classes of sedatives like barbiturates and benzodiazepines. For you, the Victorian insomniac, this means that your safer alternative to laudanum might simply be trading one set of problems for another. The immediate relief might be there, but the long-term cost could be a slow, creeping fog of physical and mental decline. The journey from the stuffy, sealed bedroom, past the heavy supper, through the perilous allure of opium, now lands you in the slightly metallic-tasting embrace of the bromides. Each step is a testament to the profound human need for rest, and the often risky lengths people will go to achieve it when it remains stubbornly out of grasp. The promise of a peaceful night was so potent it often overshadowed the potential for a very troubled tomorrow. After the rather unsettling journey through the world of potent chemicals, from the dark, addictive embrace of laudanum we previously discussed, to the dubious, metallic promise of bromides, you might be feeling a little worse for wear. And certainly no closer to a guaranteed peaceful night. Your Victorian self, perhaps now sporting a fetching bromide-induced rash, or still haunted by the lingering shadow of opium dependency, might understandably yearn for something gentler. Something that doesn't feel like quite such a gamble with your sanity or your skin. It's in this moment of weary caution that you might turn, or return, to the older, quieter wisdom of the garden and the field, herbal remedies. These are the whispers of tradition, the gentle drafts of plant-based solace that have been used for centuries to soothe troubled minds and invite slumber. Before the rise of industrial chemistry and factory-produced pills, the knowledge of medicinal plants was widespread. Every village likely had a wise woman or a local herbalist, and many households maintained their own small collection of dried herbs for common ailments. Even with the advent of more modern medicines, these traditional remedies persisted, offering a softer approach to healing and comfort. Publications like Nicholas Culpeper's The English Physician, a 17th-century herbal that remained incredibly popular and was frequently reprinted throughout the Victorian era, served as a guide for many, detailing the virtues and uses of countless native plants. So, if you were seeking sleep, the herbal kingdom offered a veritable bouquet of possibilities. After the chemical roller coaster of laudanum and bromides, a cup of chamomile tea might feel like being gently tickled by a feather. Pleasant, perhaps, but you might wonder if it's potent enough for your level of determined insomnia. One of the most well-known herbal allies for sleep, then as now, was hops. Yes, the same plant that gives beer its characteristic bitter flavor. But beyond the brewery, dried hop flowers were famed for their soporific qualities. You might find yourself stuffing a small pillow with them, a hop pillow, the idea being that the faint, earthy, slightly floral aroma released throughout the night would gently lull you to sleep. It's a rather charming image, isn't it? Resting your weary head on a cushion of potential dreams. Hop tea was another common preparation, though its taste could be quite bitter, a far cry from a sugary nightcap. The sedative effects of hops are due to compounds like humulene and lupulin, which do have mild calming properties. Then there's lavender, another enduring favorite. Its sweet, clean, floral scent was, and still is, synonymous with relaxation and cleanliness. You might have small sachets of dried lavender tucked amongst your linens, not just to make them smell pleasant and deter moths, but also to subtly perfume the air in your bedroom, creating a calming atmosphere. Lavender oil could be dabbed on the temples, or a few drops added to a warm bath before bed, if you were fortunate enough to have easy access to such a luxury. Lavender tea was also an option, a fragrant brew to sip as you wound down for the night, while perhaps not a knockout drop for severe insomnia. The psychological association of lavender with peace and tranquility undoubtedly played a part in its perceived effectiveness. Chamomile tea, with its delicate, apple-like fragrance, is another remedy that has stood the test of time. You'd steep the dried flowers in hot water, creating a pale golden infusion believed to calm the nerves and settle the stomach, both of which could contribute to a better night's rest, especially if your sleeplessness was linked to that heavy Victorian supper we talked about earlier. It was considered particularly suitable for children or those with a sensitive disposition. For your Victorian self, weary of potent concoctions, the gentle warmth and mild taste of chamomile might feel like a comforting embrace, a safe haven in your ongoing battle for sleep. A more potent, and perhaps more aromatically challenging herbal option was valerian. The root of the valerian plant has a long history of use as a sedative and anti-anxiety remedy. It was available as a tincture, often mixed with other herbs, or as a tea. While its effectiveness for some is well documented, valerian is also infamous for its rather distinctive smell. To put it politely, it's pungent. Less politely, some describe it as smelling like old, well-worn socks, perhaps with a hint of strong cheese. Sweet dreams, despite its rather assertive aroma, Many Victorians swore by its ability to calm palpitations, hysteria, and, of course, induce sleep. You might hold your nose and gulp it down, hoping the benefits outweighed the olfactory assault. And, treading carefully, we must acknowledge the poppy. While laudanum was a concentrated opium tincture, the simpler, traditional use of poppy heads or petals to make a mildly sedative tea also existed. This poppy tea would have contained a much lower and more variable concentration of opiates than laudanum, but the connection is undeniable. It speaks to the long human history with the poppy plant as a source of both pain relief and sleep. However, even in this milder form, the potential for dependence and ill effects, especially with incorrect preparation or dosage, was still present, a gentle echo of laudanum's louder warnings. One of the more quirky or fringe plant-based sedatives you might encounter was lacticarium, sometimes referred to as lettuce opium. This milky substance is extracted from the stems of wild lettuce varieties, Lactuca virosa. It was reputed to have mild analgesic and sedative properties, though without the severe addictive potential of true opium. You might find it in some patent medicines or hear it recommended as a gentle alternative for calming nerves or promoting rest. It never achieved the widespread fame of hops or lavender, but it's a fascinating example of the Victorians exploring every corner of the botanical world for solutions to their sleeplessness. Historians still argue whether the gradual decline of herbal medicine's official status in the later 19th century, as the medical profession became more organized and new synthetic drugs emerged, was primarily due to the perceived greater efficacy and reliability of these new chemical compounds, or if there was also a deliberate, perhaps commercially driven, effort by the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry to marginalize traditional, plant-based practices. It's likely a combination of factors. But it meant that while these herbal whispers of hops and lavender continued in homes, the louder pronouncements often came from the chemist's bottle. Still, for you, the Victorian insomniac, turning to these herbal remedies could offer a sense of agency and a connection to a more natural approach. If one herb didn't bring relief, you could always try another combination. The Victorian medicine cabinet, or at least the home apothecary, was often a bit of a pick and mix of dried leaves, flowers, and roots, each holding a possibility of drowsiness. You might sit by your window, sipping a carefully brewed tisane, the scent of herbs mingling with the ever-present coal smoke from outside, hoping that this time, nature's gentle hand would finally guide you into the land of dreams, far from the anxieties and the relentless progress of your bustling century. So, you've sipped your fragrant lavender tea and perhaps nestled your head on a pillow brimming with hops, as we explored in our last chat about herbal whispers. Maybe these gentle, traditional remedies brought you a measure of peace, a slight softening of the edges of your persistent wakefulness. But what if your Victorian insomnia is a more stubborn beast? What if the subtle coaxing of chamomile and the earthy scent of valerian, which, let's be honest, still smells like a dare, simply aren't enough to conquer the anxieties that keep you tethered to the conscious world? Well, the Victorian era, never short on inventive, if sometimes alarming solutions, had another, far more invigorating approach you might consider: hydropathy, the water cure. Forget gentle sips. Prepare for an altogether more bracing encounter with H2O. If herbal remedies were a soft suggestion, hydropathy was often a rather forceful command. It rose to immense popularity during the 19th century, championed by pioneers like Vincent Priesnitz in Austria, whose methods spread across Europe and to Britain, or figures like Dr. James Manby Gully, who famously treated Charles Darwin and Alfred. Lord Tennyson, though not solely for insomnia, established renowned hydropathic institutions. The central idea was that water, in its various forms and temperatures, could be a powerful therapeutic agent, capable of curing a vast array of ailments, from gout to dyspepsia, and yes, that all-consuming Victorian nervousness and its attendant sleeplessness. The theory, as they understood it, involved stimulating the circulation, toning the nerves, purifying the body by eliminating toxins through the skin, and generally shocking the system into a healthier state. It's less of a gentle nudge towards dreamland and more like being rudely awakened by a bucket of icy reality, which, paradoxically, was supposed to make you sleepy later. Victorian logic, eh? Imagine yourself having perhaps heard glowing testimonials or read persuasive pamphlets, arriving at a hydropathic establishment, a hydro as they were commonly known. These were often imposing buildings, sometimes set in picturesque countryside, promising a restorative escape. But don't envision a modern spa with fluffy ropes and soothing whale song just yet. The regimen here could be surprisingly rigorous and often decidedly chilly. One of the cornerstone treatments you might experience was the cold bath. This wasn't necessarily a leisurely dip. It could involve full immersion in unheated water, sometimes for a specific doctor-prescribed duration. The initial shock would be intense, taking your breath away, but proponents claimed it invigorated the system and, through some mysterious process, calmed agitated nerves in the long run. Then there was the famous wet sheet pack. This involved being stripped down and then tightly wrapped, mummy style, in cold, damp linen sheets. You'd then be covered with a pile of blankets to encourage sweating. You'd lie there, a human burrito in cold, damp linen, for an hour or more. The height of 19th century spa luxury. Or, as it might feel to you, a one-way ticket to mild hypothermia with a side of profound claustrophobia. The idea was that this process would draw out toxins and heat from the body, eventually leading to a feeling of calm and, hopefully, subsequent sleepiness through sheer exhaustion or perhaps relief at being unwrapped. Effusions were another popular technique. This is where an attendant would pour pitcher after pitcher of cold, or sometimes alternating hot and cold, water over specific parts of your body, or all over. You might be standing, shivering, as cascades of water sluiced over your head and shoulders. Douches took this a step further, employing jets of water, sometimes quite forceful, directed at particular areas. Imagine a targeted aquatic assault, all in the name of therapeutic benefit. It was believed these treatments stimulated the nerves and circulation in a uniquely beneficial way. You might also encounter various compresses, cloths soaked in cold or sometimes warm water, applied to the head, an aching joint, or the abdomen to soothe or stimulate. Some hydropathic routines were particularly demanding. One quirky and rather bracing tidbit from the era describes patients in certain establishments being woken incredibly early, think 4 or 5 a.m., well before dawn, specifically for a round of cold water treatments, regardless of the season or the outside temperature. The discipline itself was considered part of the cure. Alongside the external applications of water, you'd likely be encouraged to drink copious amounts of it too, several pints a day, to help flush the system. So, you're not just being doused and wrapped, you're also internally irrigated. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of hydropathy, which many patients genuinely reported, stem primarily from the direct physiological effects of the water treatments themselves, like changes in circulation and body temperature. The strictly regimented and often healthier lifestyle imposed at these establishments, regular meals, early nights, if you could sleep, exercise, and an escape from city pollution. Or if it was a powerful placebo effect amplified by the often communal and highly dedicated atmosphere of the hydro. Charles Darwin, for instance, seemed to find relief from his chronic illnesses with Dr. Gully's water cure, though he also found some of the treatments, like the wet sheet wrap, quite trying. For you, the Victorian insomniac, the experience could be transformative, for better or worse. The sheer shock and vigor of the treatments might indeed jolt your system out of its nervous rut. The enforced routine, the fresh air if the hydro was rurally located, and the focus on your physical well-being could certainly have positive effects. Exhaustion, too, can be a powerful soporific. After a day of being hosed down, vigorously scrubbed, dunked, and wrapped like a leftover Christmas pudding, sleep might have come simply as a form of blessed surrender. Or you might just lie there, cleaner than you've ever been, but also colder, and still wide awake, contemplating the particular genius of a cure that seemed to involve making you feel temporarily worse in the hope of feeling better later. These water cures represent another fascinating facet of the Victorian search for solutions to suffering. It was an era that embraced both delicate herbalism and rather aggressive physical interventions, all with the same earnest hope of restoring balance and finding relief. As you towel yourself off after a particularly bracing douche, or emerge blinking from your damp cocoon of sheets, you might ponder the resilience of the human spirit and the extraordinary lengths to which you and your fellow Victorians would go in the relentless, often chilly, pursuit of a good night's sleep. Right then, you've endured the bracing, sometimes shocking, embrace of the water cure as we just shivered through together. Perhaps those icy douches and damp sheet wraps did manage to jolt your system into a state of exhausted surrender, finally granting you a few hours of respite. But what if even that rigorous regimen failed to quell the restless turmoil in your mind? What if your Victorian insomnia stemmed from a place deeper than could be reached by cold water or herbal infusions? For those seeking solace from their relentless wakefulness, and for a society increasingly fascinated by the unseen forces that might govern human experience, the mysterious and often controversial practices of mesmerism and its descendant, hypnotism, offered a different kind of pathway into the arms of Morpheus. Leaving behind the purely physical or chemical approaches, you might find yourself drawn to a dimly lit parlor, the air thick with anticipation, to consult a practitioner of these arcane arts. Mesmerism, also known as animal magnetism, had been around since the late 18th century, thanks to its flamboyant founder Franz Anton Mesmer, but its popularity ebbed and flowed, continuing to capture the Victorian imagination. Mesmer's theory revolved around an invisible, universal fluid, animal magnetism, naturally, which he believed permeated everything. This invisible fluid was apparently everywhere, a bit like Wi-Fi in the modern age. But instead of connecting you to the internet, it connected you to, well, no one was entirely sure what it connected you to. But it sounded terribly profound and was thought to be crucial for health. Illness, including your stubborn insomnia, was supposedly caused by blockages or imbalances in this fluid within your body. The mesmerist, therefore, was someone who believed they could perceive and manipulate this fluid, often using a combination of intense gazes, slow, sweeping hand gestures called passes made over your body, without necessarily touching you, and sometimes direct touch to specific points. The aim was to unblock the flow, restore harmony, and induce a trance-like state, or even a deep, refreshing sleep. You might sit in a chair, the mesmerist standing before you, their eyes locked on yours. It's like a very intense, slightly unnerving staring contest, and if you lose, or rather, if you're susceptible, you might indeed find your eyelids growing heavy, your anxieties receding, and a strange, calm drowsiness enveloping you. Some mesmerists employed rather theatrical props. One quirky, and rather famous, apparatus was the baquet. This was a large tub or vat, often made of oak, filled with magnetized water, iron filings, and powdered glass. Protruding from the baquet were iron rods, which several patients could hold simultaneously or apply to their afflicted body parts, all hoping to absorb a therapeutic dose of that vital magnetic fluid. These group sessions could become quite dramatic, with some participants sighing, weeping, laughing uncontrollably, or falling into swoons, a phenomenon known as a mesmeric crisis, which was, believe it or not, often seen as a positive sign that the treatment was working. For you, the insomniac, the hope would be that this magnetic readjustment would calm your overactive mind and allow natural sleep to follow. However, mesmerism was always dogged by controversy. Mainstream medical practitioners often dismissed it as pure quackery, its practitioners as charlatans preying on the gullible. The very idea of an invisible fluid in the often theatrical performances didn't sit well with the increasingly scientific outlook of many doctors. Yet, for others, including some respected physicians and a host of desperate patients, it seemed to offer genuine relief where other treatments had failed. As the 19th century progressed, attempts were made to place these phenomena on a more scientific footing. Enter James Braid, a Scottish surgeon, who in the 1840s began to study these trance states. He rejected Mesmer's fluid theory and instead proposed that the effects were due to prolonged, fixed attention and suggestion, a physiological process within the patient's own mind and body. He coined the term hypnotism, derived from hypnos, the Greek god of sleep, to describe this state, hoping to give it medical legitimacy and distance it from the more outlandish claims of mesmerism. This was a mainstream historical shift, attempting to rationalize the observed effects. Under hypnotism, the focus shifted more towards verbal suggestion. The hypnotist might use a monotonous tone of voice, encouraging you to relax, telling you your eyelids were growing heavy, that you were feeling sleepy, very sleepy. They might have you fixate on a bright object. For someone struggling with insomnia, the direct suggestion of sleep, delivered with authority in a calm, controlled environment, could be powerfully effective. Early uses of hypnotism even included attempts at surgical anesthesia, with some remarkable successes reported before the widespread adoption of ether and chloroform. So, if it could potentially block out the pain of an amputation, surely it could help you drift off for a few hours. Public demonstrations of both mesmerism and hypnotism were also common, often blurring the lines between therapy and entertainment. Stage hypnotists would induce volunteers to perform all sorts of amusing or bizarre actions, which, while entertaining for the audience, perhaps didn't always help the medical credibility of the practice. You might attend such a demonstration out of curiosity, and seeing someone else seemingly fall into a deep sleep on command could spark a glimmer of hope for your own sleepless nights. Historians still argue whether the therapeutic success is attributed to mesmerism and early hypnotism, and there were many anecdotal reports of success, particularly for nervous conditions like yours, where genuine effects of these specific practices, powerful manifestations of the placebo effect and the patient's belief, were early, unrefined explorations of psychological principles like suggestion, dissociation, and the profound influence of the therapist-patient relationship. It's likely a complex mix of all these elements. So, did it actually cure your insomnia? You might find yourself under the mesmerist's spell or the hypnotist's calm instruction, and perhaps, just perhaps, the weight of your worries lifts. Your breathing deepens, your limbs grow heavy, and the chattering voices in your mind finally fall silent. Maybe you achieve a state of profound relaxation, or even genuine sleep. Or maybe you just fainted from the intensity of it all, or the sheer boredom of staring at a pocket watch. Either way, for a little while at least, you weren't awake, so success, of a sort. For the Victorian insomniac, perpetually battling that nervousness we've spoken of, and perhaps disillusioned by the side effects of drugs or the rigors of the water cure we just endured, the allure of a treatment that promised to soothe the mind itself, through mysterious gazes or gentle commands, was a powerful and understandable draw. It was a journey into the largely uncharted territory of your own consciousness, hoping to find the switch that would finally dim the lights. All right, so you've perhaps submitted yourself to the intense gaze of the mesmerist, or listened to the soothing, repetitive suggestions of the hypnotist. As we explored in our last foray into the Victorian mind, maybe those journeys into your consciousness brought you some measure of peace, a temporary truce with your wakeful nights. But the Victorian era was not just an age of spiritual seeking and psychological curiosity. It was, quintessentially, an age of invention, of cogs and gears, of brass and steam. If a problem existed, surely a machine could be built to solve it. And your pesky insomnia, that relentless thief of nightly rest, was no exception. So, if the ethereal didn't quite cut it, You might find yourself turning to the wonderfully tangible, if sometimes bewildering, world of mechanical sleep aids. The sheer ingenuity, and occasionally, the sheer audacity, of Victorian inventors knew few bounds. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the magnificent Crystal Palace in London, was a testament to this spirit. Showcasing thousands of inventions, from mighty steam engines to delicate household gadgets. While not every invention was aimed at curing your sleeplessness, the general atmosphere was one of fervent belief in technological progress to solve all human ills. It was only natural, then, that this inventive zeal would be directed towards the bedroom. If you couldn't be coaxed or medicated into slumber, perhaps you could be engineered into it. Some of these devices looked less like gentle sleep aids and more like they were designed by a particularly enthusiastic, if slightly confused, octopus with a penchant for brass fittings and leather straps. Assembly probably required an advanced engineering degree and a very stiff drink. Consider, for instance, the ongoing battle with that dreaded night air we discussed earlier. While simply flinging open a window was a no-go for many, the need for some kind of air circulation in those stuffy bedrooms was dimly recognized. This led to various ventilation contraptions. You might encounter elaborate systems of pipes and bellows designed to draw in outside air, filter it through water or charcoal to remove those nasty miasmas, of course, and then gently waft it into your room. Or perhaps a clockwork-powered fan, whirring away with a determined, if somewhat noisy, diligence, creating a gentle breeze. Some machines designed to create soothing sounds or purified air probably just added another fascinating, or irritating, layer to the nocturnal cacophony we talked about earlier. Like fighting fire with a slightly less aggressive, but more consistently rhythmic, fire. Then there was the idea of motion. Everyone knew that babies were often soothed to sleep by gentle rocking. So why not adults? This led to the invention of various rocking beds or mechanical cradles for grown-ups. Imagine your sturdy Victorian bedstead mounted on a mechanism that would allow it to sway gently from side to side, or perhaps tilt rhythmically head to toe. Some were manually operated by a long-suffering spouse or servant pulling a lever, while others boasted sophisticated clockwork motors that could keep you gently oscillating for hours. You'd lie there, a fully grown adult, being rocked like an oversized infant, hoping the rhythmic movement would trick your agitated brain into surrendering to sleep. Electricity, that marvelous and mysterious new force, also captured the Victorian imagination as a potential panacea. If it could power lights and send messages whizzing along telegraph wires, surely it could soothe your jangled nerves. This led to a bewildering array of electromagnetic devices. You might find yourself wearing a special electric belt or galvanic corset to bed. A contraption often made of metal plates interwoven with fabric, supposedly generating a mild, continuous electrical current to calm your system and promote healthy sleep. There were also magnetic insoles for your slippers or headbands embedded with magnets, all designed to rebalance your body's animal magnetism. Remember that from our chat about Mesmer? But this time with a tangible, wearable gadget. A particularly quirky fringe device you might hear whispers of was the electric bath, where a mild current was passed through the bathwater. A sort of gentle, full-body electrostimulation session before bedtime. Beyond general calming, some contraptions aim to directly induce sleep through sensory manipulation. Early attempts at white noise machines might involve clockwork devices that produced a monotonous dripping sound, a gentle whirring, or even a simulated purring. Anything to mask the disturbing silence or the jarring city noises. Conversely, if noise was your primary enemy, you might invest in elaborate earplugs made of gutta percha or vulcanized rubber, or even padded helmets designed to create a cocoon of silence around your head, though one imagines these could be rather warm and cumbersome. Postural correctness was another fixation. Perhaps your inability to sleep was simply due to lying down incorrectly. This led to the design of specialized pillows shaped to hold your head at a precise angle, or even bed frames with adjustable sections to elevate your feet or torso to what was deemed the optimal sleeping position for nerve health and digestion. You might find yourself strapped or wedged into a particular configuration, feeling less like you were about to drift off to sleep and more like you were being prepared for a rather uncomfortable medical procedure. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of these often bizarre mechanical cures in the Victorian era primarily reflected a genuine, almost childlike belief in technological solutions for absolutely all human problems, including the most intimate and complex ones like sleep, or if it was largely driven by opportunistic inventors and savvy marketers who were quick to capitalize on widespread public anxieties about health and the desperate desire for quick fixes. It was likely a bit of both, a sincere inventive spirit meeting a ready market of hopeful, and often sleepless, consumers. So you lie there in your Victorian bed, perhaps gently rocking, fanned by a clockwork breeze, a mild current thrumming through your electric corset, your head nestled in a scientifically angled pillow. If you didn't actually fall asleep from all these ministrations, you might at least be too bewildered or too amused by the sheer mechanical effort involved to remember that you were an insomniac in the first place. It's a testament to the era's boundless optimism in the face of a problem as old as humanity itself. The simple, desperate yearning for a good night's rest, pursued with all the mechanical ingenuity the age could muster. So, you've potentially been rocked, fanned, and mildly electrified by some of the curious contraptions we just peeked at, all in pursuit of that elusive Victorian coma. Perhaps those mechanical marvels brought you some relief. Or perhaps they simply added a new layer of bewildering experience to your sleepless nights. If the cogs and gears didn't quite deliver the peaceful oblivion you crave, your thoughts, or the advice of a progressively minded physician, might turn towards something seemingly more natural, something that involves your own body's volition, exercise. But don't imagine a modern, high-intensity workout session just yet. In the Victorian era, particularly for the genteel classes, the approach to physical activity, much like their approach to fresh air, was often wrapped in layers of caution, propriety, and some rather specific ideas about what was good for your delicate constitution and ultimately, your sleep. After being passively manipulated by machines or mesmerists, the idea of actively doing something to improve your chances of sleep might seem appealing. And indeed, there was a growing, albeit sometimes hesitant, recognition that physical exertion could play a role in overall health and, by extension, in combating that pervasive Victorian nervousness that so often led to staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. The key, however, was moderation and appropriateness, especially if you were a lady. The recommended exercise for ladies was often so gentle. You'd probably burn more calories anxiously fanning yourself after a shocking piece of gossip than partaking in a brisk turnabout the meticulously kept rose garden. Walking was, by far, the most universally accepted form of exercise. A daily constitutional walk was considered essential for maintaining health. You don your walking boots, your bonnet, and perhaps several layers of clothing, and set off at a steady, respectable pace. Not too fast, mind you. Becoming flushed or out of breath might be seen as rather unseemly, particularly for a woman. The aim was to stimulate circulation, take in some, hopefully, freshish air, and provide a gentle distraction from worries. A good, long walk could indeed lead to a pleasant sense of fatigue that might make sleep come a little easier. For men, the options were gradually expanding, partly thanks to movements like muscular Christianity, which emerged in the mid-19th century. This was a mainstream historical development that promoted the idea of physical health and vigor as components of moral and spiritual well-being, making activities like rowing, cricket, and later, rugby and football, more respectable. A man might engage in these more strenuous pursuits, which would certainly tire him out. However, the timing was still crucial. Vigorous activity too close to bedtime was generally discouraged, as it was thought to be overly stimulating, potentially making sleep even harder to achieve. For women, and for men of a more delicate or studious disposition, gentler forms of calisthenics were becoming popular. Systems like the Swedish exercises, developed by Per Henrik Ling, which involved controlled movements, stretching, and gymnastics, were adapted for home use. You might have a little illustrated booklet showing you how to perform various graceful bends, arm circles, and leg lifts, all designed to improve posture and promote harmonious development without undue strain. Horseback riding, for those who could afford the animal and the accoutrements, was another popular activity, considered both healthful and elegant, though again, a gentle canter was preferred over a wild gallop if pre-sleep tranquility was the goal. Gardening, too, involving gentle digging, weeding, and pottering about amongst the plants, could provide both fresh air and mild physical exertion. The great fear, particularly concerning women, was overexertion. It was widely believed that women were inherently more fragile, their nervous systems more finely tuned and susceptible to shock. Too much physical activity, or activity that was too vigorous or unfeminine, could supposedly lead to all sorts of dire consequences, from damaging their reproductive health to inducing nervous exhaustion, thereby worsening insomnia rather than curing it. Be careful with that energetic stroll around the park. You wouldn't want to overdo it and accidentally develop a healthy, rosy glow. The sheer shock might keep you awake for a week. Historians still argue whether the Victorian caution around female exercise and the types of activities deemed appropriate for them was primarily rooted in genuine, if misguided, medical concerns about their perceived physical and nervous frailty, or if it was more deeply intertwined with prevailing social ideologies designed to restrict women's public roles, their physical freedom, and maintain rigid gender distinctions. It's a complex debate, but the practical outcome was that your options for a sleep-inducing workout might be rather limited if you were a Victorian lady. One slightly quirky, and definitely not mainstream, idea that floated around some health reform circles was the concept of the air bath. This involved exercising, often doing light calisthenics or simply being exposed to the air, while nude or very lightly clad, preferably in a private outdoor space or a well-ventilated room. The theory was that this maximized the beneficial effects of fresh air and light on the skin, invigorating the whole system. Given the Victorian penchant for multiple layers of clothing and their anxieties about the night air, this was a pretty radical notion, and certainly not something you discuss in polite company, but it shows the fringes of thought on health and the body. So, you try to incorporate some sensible exercise into your routine. Perhaps a brisk walk in the afternoon, or some carefully executed drawing room calisthenics. You feel a pleasant tiredness in your limbs, a sense of having done something virtuous for your health. The ideal was to find that perfect balance, enough exertion to tire the body, but not so much as to overstimulate the mind or exhaust the vital forces. And it had to be done at the right time of day, in the right attire, possibly with the right, demure facial expression if you were out in public. It's a wonder anyone bothered, given the potential for getting it wrong. As bedtime approaches, you might hope that this physical activity will stand you in good stead. Perhaps the regular rhythm of your walk, or the controlled movements of your exercises, have helped to dispel some of that restless energy. Unlike the passivity of being dosed with laudanum or rocked in a mechanical bed, there's a sense of self-reliance in this approach. Yet, even here, the Victorian anxieties and prescriptions are present, shaping how you move, when you move, and how much you dare to exert yourself in your quest for a night where your body is tired enough and your mind calm enough to finally welcome sleep. All right. So you've dutifully taken your constitutional walks, perhaps even engaged in some graceful, if rather restrained, drawing room calisthenics, as we explored in our look at the Victorian approach to exercise. You've tried to gently tire your body, hoping to coax your restless mind into following suit. Now, as evening descends and you prepare to once again face the nightly challenge of finding sleep, your attention returns to that most crucial of arenas, the bedchamber itself. We've already discussed the imperative of sealing it against the dreaded night air, remember? But beyond that fundamental precaution, how else did you, as a conscientious Victorian, attempt to optimize this inner sanctum for peaceful rest? What about the very fabric, furnishings, and atmosphere of the room where you hoped Morpheus would finally pay a visit? Let's start with the centerpiece, the bed. Getting into a typical Victorian bed, especially in a more affluent household, was less about casually slipping between the sheets and more like embarking on an archaeological dig through multiple geological strata of linen, wool, and perhaps a touch of existential dread. The mattress itself might be a source of contention. You could be lying on a firm horsehair mattress, which was durable but could feel rather unyielding, or perhaps a softer feather bed, which sounded luxurious but could quickly become lumpy, hot, and a haven for tiny, unwelcome guests if not meticulously aired and cleaned. Straw-filled paillasses were common too, especially in less wealthy homes, offering a rustling, somewhat prickly foundation. The slow introduction of sprung mattresses later in the century promised a new level of comfort, but they were an expensive novelty for a long time. On top of this foundation, layers abounded. Linen sheets, often cool to the touch initially, would be covered by woolen blankets, several of them in winter, and then perhaps a heavy quilt or a decorative counterpane. If you had a grand four-poster bed, a common feature in well-to-do homes, it would likely be adorned with thick, elaborate hangings. This was a mainstream historical feature, designed not just for impressive display, but, crucially, for warmth and privacy, effectively creating a small, draft-excluded room within the larger, colder bedchamber. While cozy in theory, these hangings also restricted airflow, contributing to that stuffy atmosphere we've mentioned before. Pillows were no less substantial. You'd likely have large, firm bolsters stretching the width of the bed, and then an assortment of softer, feather pillows to prop yourself up. Reading in bed, or simply sitting up to sip a nightcap, required a veritable mountain of support. And all this bedding, the sheets, the blankets, the pillowcases, the heavy curtains, represented a constant battle against dust and grime, requiring diligent laundering, beatings, and airing to maintain even a semblance of hygiene by Victorian standards. The furniture surrounding your bed also played its part. Victorian taste leaned towards the substantial and the ornate. Heavy mahogany or oak wardrobes, chest of drawers, and dressing tables would dominate the room, their dark, polished surfaces reflecting the flickering candlelight or gaslight. And clutter. Oh, the Victorians adored their knickknacks. Surfaces might be laden with photographs in silver frames, porcelain figurines, sentimental keepsakes, books, and various decorative boxes. With enough dusty drapes, patterned wallpaper, and brooding mahogany furniture, your bedroom could achieve a truly impressive level of haunted house chic, which, one might argue, is very conducive to, well, staying keenly alert for unexpected spectral visitors, perhaps, rather than deep sleep. Historians still argue whether this typically cluttered and heavily furnished Victorian interior, with its layers of fabric and profusion of objects, was generally perceived by its inhabitants as cozy, secure, and comforting, or if, by our more minimalist modern standards, it might have inadvertently contributed to a sense of visual overwhelm, stuffiness, and ultimately, poorer sleep hygiene. Temperature regulation, as we've touched upon, was a constant challenge. The fireplace was the primary source of heat. You'd want it to provide warmth, but not so much that the room became an oven, and certainly not so little that the fire died out, leaving you to shiver through the small hours. Achieving that perfect, Goldilocks zone temperature usually involved a delicate and often frustrating dance between being slowly par-smoked by a sulky coal fire that belched fumes, or waking up to find your breath misting in the air and a distinct layer of frost on the inside of the window pane. There wasn't much of a reliable happy medium. Light, or the lack thereof, was another key consideration. Those heavy curtains did double duty, keeping out both the miasmatic night air and any intrusive moonlight or the orange glare of street gas lamps. For illumination within the room, you'd rely on candles or, in more modern homes, gaslight. Both came with their own issues: the fire risk of candles, the smell and heat of gas, and the fact that neither offered the instant on-off convenience we take for granted. Ensuring true darkness, believed to be essential for good sleep, meant carefully extinguishing every flame. Beyond the physical, there was the atmosphere. Quiet was paramount. Thick carpets, heavy curtains, and solidly built furniture all helped to absorb sound from outside or from other parts of the house. If you lived in a noisy city, this was a constant battle. Smells, too, were important. In an era before modern plumbing and sanitation were universal, and with the lingering sense of coal smoke, cooking, and inadequate ventilation, unpleasant odors could be a real problem. To combat these, and to create a more pleasing environment, you might use potpourri, bowls of dried flowers and spices, or sprinkle lavender water on your linens. Harking back to those herbal remedies we discussed, some even used fumigators, burning pastilles or ribbons impregnated with incense or aromatic substances to purify the air. One quirky tidbit you might encounter in your quest for the perfectly optimized bedchamber is the specific attention paid to certain details. Some household manuals or health advisors might suggest that the type of wood your furniture was made from could affect your nervous disposition and thus your sleep, perhaps warning against overly stimulating walnut. For instance, even the patterns on your wallpaper might come under scrutiny, with busy or garish designs deemed potentially agitating to the sensitive Victorian mind. And, of course, a well-ordered room, clean and tidy, was seen as reflecting a well-ordered mind, a prerequisite for peaceful rest. Tucked discreetly beside the bed, you might find a nightingale table, a small, often elegant piece of furniture specifically designed with a little cupboard, a polite concealment for that essential piece of Victorian bedroom pottery, the chamber pot. Every detail mattered in this carefully constructed environment, all in service of wooing that elusive state of unconsciousness. So, you've meticulously arranged your Victorian bedchamber, haven't you? Layer upon layer of bedding, heavy curtains drawn tight against the night, perhaps even a potpourri gently scenting the air, all in the hope of creating that perfect cocoon for sleep. As we just discussed. But what if, after all that effort, after ensuring your room is a veritable fortress of supposed tranquility, you still find yourself lying wide awake? Your mind racing like one of those newfangled steam locomotives? If perfecting your physical environment hasn't solved the riddle of your sleeplessness, your Victorian doctor, or indeed the prevailing wisdom of the age, might suggest that the root of the problem lies not in your mattress or your wallpaper, but within your very nerves. The 19th century was, as we've touched upon, an era of immense change, industrialization, urbanization, rapid technological advancements, and shifting social structures. And with all this progress came a perceived epidemic of what was often termed nervousness. This wasn't just a fleeting feeling of anxiety, it was considered a genuine affliction. A sign that the delicate human nervous system was struggling to cope with the relentless demands of modern life. Coined by the American neurologist George Miller Beard in 1869, it quickly became a go-to explanation for a whole host of debilitating symptoms. Imagine yourself consulting a physician about your persistent insomnia. After listening to your woes, he might nod gravely and pronounce you a sufferer of neurasthenia. The symptoms would sound depressingly familiar to you: chronic fatigue, anxiety, headaches, irritability, a general feeling of malaise, digestive issues, and, of course, that stubborn inability to sleep. Sufferers often reported a feeling that the 19th century was just far too much to handle, which, if we're honest, is a sentiment many of us can relate to after spending more than 10 minutes scrolling through our own modern-day news feeds. The causes of neurasthenia, according to Beard and his contemporaries, were manifold. The mental strain of intellectual labor, the hectic pace of city life, the constant stimulation of new inventions. Even the vibrations from railways and machinery were sometimes implicated. This diagnosis was crucial because it framed your insomnia not merely as an isolated symptom, but as a key indicator of a more profound systemic disorder of your nerves. Your nerve force, a concept popular at the time, was thought to be a finite resource, much like the battery on your, as yet uninvented, smartphone. If you depleted this precious energy through excessive worry, overwork, or too much excitement, you'd find yourself running on empty. Your nerves frayed, leaving you staring at the darkened ceiling at 2 in the morning, unable to switch off. There was no handy USB charger for your Victorian nerve force, unfortunately. Beyond neurasthenia, other concepts of nervous disorders abounded. Hysteria, a diagnosis almost exclusively applied to women, often included sleep disturbances among its bewildering array of symptoms, which could range from fainting spells and emotional outbursts to paralysis and sensory changes. The treatments for hysteria were often quite different from those for male neurasthenia, reflecting the era's deeply ingrained gender biases. There was also a lingering moral dimension to some discussions of nervousness. While medical explanations were gaining traction, an undercurrent of thought sometimes suggested that an inability to cope or to sleep might also stem from a lack of willpower, poor moral discipline, or an overly indulgent lifestyle, particularly if you were from the leisured classes. So, how would your Victorian doctor approach your neurasthenic insomnia? One of the most famous and controversial treatments was the rest cure, pioneered by another American neurologist, Drive S. Where Mitchell. If you were prescribed this, you'd be in for an intense experience. The rest cure typically involved weeks, sometimes months, of enforced bed rest and almost complete isolation from friends, family, and familiar routines. You'd be forbidden from reading, writing, or any form of mental exertion. Your diet would be strictly controlled, often involving large quantities of milk and fatty foods, sometimes force-fed if your appetite waned. Massage and electrotherapy were also frequently employed to maintain muscle tone and stimulate the nerves. The aim was to completely remove all sources of stress and rebuild that depleted nerve force. For some, this enforced passivity and nourishment might have, eventually, led to a kind of exhausted sleep. For others, like the author Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was a searing critique of her own experience with a modified rest cure, it was a recipe for mental torment. The rest cure: lie in bed for weeks on end. Eat like you're earnestly training for a sumo wrestling competition and engage in conversation with absolutely no one. Sounds like a dream holiday for certain personality types. A direct route to an existential crisis for others. And as for your insomnia? Well, you'd certainly have an abundance of undisturbed time to ponder it. Not all treatments were so extreme. Doctors might also prescribe nerve tonics, which could paradoxically contain stimulants like strychnine or arsenic in supposedly therapeutic doses, intended to strengthen the weakened nerves. Or they might advise a change of scene, travel to the seaside or the countryside to escape the pressures of urban life. Strict regimens regarding intellectual work, advising limits on reading or study, especially before bedtime, were common. And for those whose nervous disorders were deemed particularly severe, where insomnia was a prominent and intractable feature of a more profound mental illness, the asylum loomed as a place of last resort. One quirky and rather telling belief was that certain leisure activities, particularly for women, could be detrimental to nervous health and sleep. Excessive novel reading, especially of the sensational or overly romantic variety, was sometimes warned against. It was thought that such stories could overstimulate the imagination and emotions of impressionable young ladies, leading to a state of nervous agitation quite incompatible with a peaceful night's rest. So that thrilling page-turner might be the very thing keeping you from turning in. Historians still argue whether neurasthenia, this quintessential Victorian malady, Was a distinct medical condition truly reflecting the physiological and psychological pressures of 19th century life? A broader cultural metaphor for widespread anxieties about modernity and societal change, or perhaps a convenient, all-encompassing diagnostic label for a wide range of physical and psychological ailments that were simply poorly understood at the time, regardless of its precise nature. The concept of nerves and nervous exhaustion profoundly shaped how Victorians understood and attempted to treat persistent insomnia, seeing it not just as a lack of sleep, but as a symptom of a deeper imbalance in their very being, brought on by the relentless march of their own remarkable, yet often overwhelming, century. So, you've explored the possibility that your stubborn insomnia is a symptom of that fashionable Victorian malady, neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion, as we just discussed. Perhaps you've even endured the rigors of a prescribed rest cure, or dabbled with nerve tonics, hoping to soothe your overtaxed system. But what if these official medical routes prove too slow, too expensive, or simply ineffective against your nightly wakefulness? What if you're looking for a solution that's readily available, loudly proclaimed, and promises swift relief without the need for a doctor's consultation? Well, then you, like countless other Victorians, might find your gaze drawn to the alluring, brightly printed advertisements that fill the pages of every newspaper and magazine. The world of patent medicines. Prepare to enter a realm of miracle cures, secret formulas, and often very empty promises. These patent medicines, also known as proprietary medicines, were a colossal industry in the 19th century. They weren't patented in the modern sense of having their unique formulas protected after rigorous testing. Often, the patent simply referred to a trademark name or a claim to a secret composition. These concoctions were marketed directly to you, the consumer, with an astonishing audacity and a flair for dramatic persuasion. The advertisements, a mainstream historical feature of the era, were everywhere, forming a significant revenue stream for newspapers. They promised to cure not just one ailment, but often a whole host of them with a single bottle. Got insomnia? There's a syrup for that. Feeling generally run down from that Victorian nervousness we keep mentioning? This elixir will restore your vigor. If it also promised to shine your boots and predict the weather, it would truly be the ultimate Victorian product. The appeal was undeniable. These remedies were available over the counter at your local chemist, the grocer, or even by mail order. No need for a potentially costly or time-consuming visit to the doctor. The advertisements themselves were masterpieces of persuasive, if often misleading, prose, frequently featuring heartfelt testimonials from supposedly cured individuals, dramatic before and after scenarios, and authoritative-sounding pronouncements from professors or doctors of dubious credentials. When you're desperate for sleep, lying awake night after night, the siren song of a guaranteed sleep-inducing cordial or a nerve restorer and slumber tonic could be almost impossible to resist. But what exactly was in these miracle cures? That was often the big and dangerous mystery. The formulas were proprietary secrets, and manufacturers weren't required to list their ingredients. However, analysis over time. Many tonics and soothing syrups contain substantial amounts of it, sometimes being little more than fortified wine or spirits with some added flavorings and colorings. The secret formula for many a restorative elixir often consisted of about 80% wishful thinking on the part of the consumer, 19% highly potent alcohol, and perhaps 1% of something that might actually do something, though not necessarily what was advertised on the label. Remember laudanum, that potent opium tincture we spoke of earlier? It, or other opiates like morphine, made frequent guest appearances in these patent medicines, especially those aimed at coughs, pain relief, diarrhea, and, of course, sleeplessness. Soothing syrups for adults, and horrifyingly, for children, often owed their efficacy and their addictive potential to undisclosed opiates, bromides, which we know were used as sedatives. also found their way into many nerve tonics and sleep aids, bringing their own set of potential side effects like bromism. Later in the Victorian era, even cocaine, initially hailed for its energizing and mood-lifting properties, began to appear in some preparations. Alongside these potent drugs, there would be a mix of various herbs, some with genuine mild effects, others completely inert, all bundled together under a catchy name. And sometimes, more sinister ingredients like mercury, arsenic, or antimony could be found in these unregulated mixtures. The dangers were manifold and severe. Addiction to alcohol or opiates, unwittingly consumed in a daily dose of health tonic, was rampant. Accidental poisoning or overdose was a constant risk, especially since the concentration of active ingredients could vary wildly from batch to batch. These medicines could also mask the symptoms of serious underlying illnesses, delaying proper diagnosis and treatment until it was too late. And of course, they represented a significant financial drain, as people spent their hard-earned money on bottle after bottle of hope that rarely delivered a true, safe, or lasting cure. You might indeed find yourself drifting off after a hearty swig of Dr. Goodfellow's nocturnal nectar. Or you might just be too tipsy from the undeclared alcohol content to really care that you're still technically awake. Either way, the bottle's emptier and so's your wallet. To enhance their mystique and appeal, some patent medicine proprietors got quite creative with their branding. One quirky and common tactic was to claim their formulas were based on ancient Native American healing secrets, wisdom from the mysterious East, or recipes handed down from some obscure but revered European physician. This lent an air of exoticism and time-tested authority, making the product seem more trustworthy or potent than it actually was. Sometimes, endorsements from famous people would be used, occasionally genuine, often entirely fabricated or attributed to individuals long since deceased and unable to object. Historians still argue whether the public's widespread embrace of patent medicines in the 19th century primarily reflected their gullibility and a general lack of scientific understanding, or if it was, in some ways, a rational response given the often limited efficacy, high cost, and sometimes harsh treatments offered by orthodox medical practitioners of the time. When your doctor might offer you little more than a stern lecture on your nerves, or a prescription for something equally dubious, the promise of a readily available, affordable cure in a bottle held undeniable power. There was virtually no effective government regulation of these products for most of the Victorian era. It was a free-for-all market, where manufacturers could make almost any claim, however outlandish, and include almost any ingredient, however dangerous, without fear of reprisal. It would take many more years, and many more tragedies, before measures like the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States, and similar reforms in Britain, began to bring some semblance of control and transparency to the pharmaceutical landscape. So, as you, the weary Victorian insomniac, peruse the newspaper advertisements, confronted by a dazzling array of invigorators, balms, elixirs, and painkillers, all promising to end your sleepless nights, you are navigating a minefield of potential harm. The hope they offer is a powerful lure, but the reality is often a dangerous cocktail of undisclosed drugs, potent alcohol, and colossal marketing hype. Each bottle represents a gamble, a shot in the dark in your relentless quest for rest. We've just navigated the treacherous, brightly advertised landscape of Victorian patent medicines. Those cure-alls in a bottle that promised so much and often delivered so little, or far worse, as we discussed. You, as a discerning adult, might have learned to approach their extravagant claims with a healthy dose of skepticism, or perhaps you even fell prey to their allure in your own desperate quest for sleep. But now, let's turn our attention to an even more vulnerable segment of Victorian society, a group for whom the quest for quiet nights often took a particularly perilous turn: the children, especially the infants. If you thought managing your own insomnia was a challenge, just imagine trying to soothe the restless, Crying baby in an era with limited understanding of infant needs and even fewer safe remedies. As a Victorian parent, or perhaps a weary nursemaid, your primary goal when faced with a sleepless infant is simple: quiet. A crying baby disrupts the entire household, fraying already strained nerves. That Victorian nervousness we've talked so much about certainly didn't spare parents. The nursery itself, or the corner of your own bedchamber where the cradle sits, would be subject to the same concerns as your own sleeping space. You'd worry about warmth, fret about those insidious drafts, remember the fear of night air, and ensure the baby was well covered. Rocking was, of course, a universal soother. Elaborate wooden cradles, sometimes on rockers, sometimes designed to be swung, were a nursery staple. You might spend hours, your arm aching, your eyes heavy, gently coaxing your little one into slumber with that rhythmic motion. Perhaps humming a soft lullaby. Swaddling, tightly wrapping the infant, was also common, thought to provide a sense of security and prevent them from startling themselves awake. Dietary approaches were also popular. Many believed that a baby with a full stomach was a sleepy baby. Infants were often fed pap, a soft, bland concoction of bread soaked in water or milk, or various forms of gruel. These were easy to prepare and cheap, but not always the most nutritious or digestible options for a tiny tummy, sometimes leading to colic, which then, ironically, led to more sleeplessness for everyone. But when rocking, singing, and a belly full of pap failed to produce the desired tranquility, and when parental exhaustion reached its peak, many turned to the same source of dubious relief as adults did, those readily available medicinal concoctions. The market was flooded with soothing syrups, quieting cordials, and infants' friends, all specifically targeted at calming fretful babies and promoting sleep. After weeks, or even just days, of a baby screaming like a tiny, perpetually furious mandrake root, even the most principled and loving Victorian parent might start eyeing that little bottle of instant infant silence with a desperate, hopeful gleam in their eye. The names were often disarmingly benign. Godfrey's cordial was a massive seller, as were concoctions like Mother Bailey's quieting syrup or Street's infant's quietness. These were mainstream historical products, widely used across all social classes, but particularly common in industrial areas where mothers often had to work long hours in factories and needed their children to be quiet, perhaps while left in the care of older siblings or child minders. The tragic reality, however, was that the active ingredient in many of these soothing mixtures was, just as in many adult patent medicines, opium, laudanum, morphine, or raw opium itself, often combined with alcohol, treacle, and various aromatics to make it more palatable. The main active ingredient in Little Angel's dreamy draught was often dangerously close to being Big Angel's eternal nap inducer, if administered incorrectly or too frequently. Not quite the gentle slumber advertised on the cheerfully printed label. The consequences were devastating. Infants are exquisitely sensitive to opiates, and a dose that might merely quiet a baby could easily tip over into a dangerous stupor, coma, or even death from respiratory depression. Addiction in babies was also a horrifying, though often unrecognized, reality. Infants regularly dosed with these syrups would become listless, their development stunted, and they would suffer withdrawal symptoms, increased irritability, crying, tremors, if the syrup was withheld, leading parents to administer more, believing the original ailment had returned. The term doping was sometimes used to describe the practice of routinely quieting children with these drugs. The goal was a peacefully sleeping baby, not a tiny, unervingly still philosopher contemplating the mysteries of the universe thanks to a few too many drops of quietness. Beyond the commercially produced syrups, there were also traditional or old wives' remedies that could be equally perilous. One quirky and rather alarming tidbit sometimes encountered in old household advice was the suggestion to give a fractious baby a tiny taste of gin or beer to make it sleep. Another common practice was the use of a sugar tit or dummy, a piece of linen, or a small rag containing a lump of sugar, bread, or a mixture which the baby would suck on. Sometimes, a few drops of laudanum would be added to this comforter to ensure its efficacy. Historians still argue whether the widespread and tragic use of opiate-based soothing syrups for infants in the 19th century primarily reflected a profound lack of medical awareness of their inherent dangers and the specifics of infant physiology, or if it was driven by extreme parental desperation in the face of unrelenting infant crying and societal pressures, or perhaps, more controversially, if it indicated a more callous societal acceptance of high infant mortality rates, particularly among the working classes where life was incredibly harsh. It was likely a grim combination of all these factors. Medical understanding of addiction and appropriate pediatric dosing was in its infancy, so to speak. Parents were often exhausted and ill-informed, and the advertisements for these products were relentlessly reassuring. It's crucial to remember that these parents weren't inherently malevolent. They were often acting out of a desire to soothe their suffering child and to gain some desperately needed rest themselves, using the remedies that were widely available and socially accepted at the time. The tragedy lies in the lack of safe alternatives and the devastating impact of these dangerous substances on the most vulnerable. The quest for a quiet night in the Victorian nursery could, all too easily, lead to a permanent silence, a stark reminder of the perils lurking in those innocent-looking little bottles. We've journeyed together through the dimly lit corridors of the Victorian night, exploring a bewildering array of attempts to conquer the pervasive beast of insomnia. From your own adult struggles in stuffy, sealed bedchambers and the perilous allure of laudanum, to the sometimes bizarre mechanical contraptions, the bracing water cures, the mysterious sway of mesmerism, the tentative embrace of exercise, the deeply flawed diagnoses of neurasthenia, the dangerous promises of patent medicines, and even the heart-wrenching efforts to soothe restless infants, often with tragic consequences as we just discussed. It has been quite the odyssey. Now, as our exploration of these nocturnal battles draws towards its close, it's time to pause and reflect. Amidst all the desperation and dubious remedies, was there any enduring wisdom to be found? And what lingering shadows from their quest for sleep still touch our own, often equally wakeful, nights? Looking back at the vast pharmacopoeia and the diverse methodologies the Victorians employed, it's clear that some approaches, often the simpler or more traditional ones, held kernels of truth, even if the practitioners didn't always fully grasp the scientific reasons. Those gentle herbal whispers we talked about, chamomile to calm an anxious stomach, lavender with its soothing scent, these do possess mild anxiolytic or sedative properties that can genuinely aid relaxation and promote sleep for some. It turns out, a sensible walk in the fresh air and not ingesting vast quantities of mystery chemicals or an entire roast pheasant just before retiring for the night actually can contribute positively to your sleep. Groundbreaking stuff, I know. The very idea of a regular sleep routine, a concept they often emphasized, even if their specific bedtime rituals sometimes seem eccentric to us now, is a cornerstone of modern sleep hygiene. Their attempts to create a conducive sleep environment, while sometimes misguided, like the fear of night air leading to those stuffy rooms, did acknowledge the importance of darkness, a comfortable bed, by their standards, and quiet. Even the more theatrical practices like mesmerism or the attentive care of a physician prescribing a rest cure might have offered some benefit through the power of suggestion, the placebo effect. The disciplined lifestyle of the hydropathic establishment, regular hours, plain food, exercise, and an escape from urban chaos, could certainly have broken a cycle of insomnia for some individuals, regardless of the specific water treatments. Conversely, the list of what clearly didn't work or was actively harmful is tragically long. The widespread reliance on potent substances like laudanum and bromides, as we've seen, led to devastating addiction, toxicity, and untold suffering, despite their initial promise of oblivion. The unregulated free-for-all of the patent medicine industry, with its false claims and dangerous, undisclosed ingredients, preyed mercilessly on the vulnerable and the desperate. Many of the more elaborate mechanical contraptions were likely more trouble and more noisy than they were worth. And the extreme fear of night air, leading to poorly ventilated sleeping quarters, undoubtedly contributed to discomfort and poor sleep quality. Yet, even in their errors, there are lessons. The Victorian era's intense focus on insomnia did bring the problem out of the shadows, acknowledging it as a legitimate ailment worthy of medical and societal attention. This was a crucial step. Their explorations into nerves and conditions like neurasthenia, while framed by the biases and limited understanding of their time, represented early attempts to grapple with the mind-body connection and the impact of stress and environment on well-being, including sleep. The public health disasters wrought by unregulated medicines eventually spurred movements for reform, laying some of the groundwork for the safer pharmaceutical practices we expect today. The Victorians, in their often fumbling way, helped to initiate a longer conversation about sleep that continues into our own time. They left us many things: impressive feats of engineering, wonderfully convoluted novels, and a very healthy suspicion of anything boldly labeled miracle sleep tonic, now with extra opium. The late Victorian period also saw the very beginnings of more recognizably scientific sleep research. A slow shift away from purely empirical observations or speculative theories towards controlled studies, however rudimentary. Questions about the duration of sleep, the nature of dreams, and the physiological changes during slumber started to be investigated with a new rigor, paving the way for future discoveries. One of the quirky, though deeply unsettling, anxieties that plagued some Victorians, certainly not conducive to a good night's rest, was taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. This fear was so prevalent that it led to the invention of safety coffins equipped with bells, flags, or speaking tubes, allowing a prematurely interred individual to signal for help. While not a sleep cure itself, this profound fear underscores the layers of anxiety that could pervade the Victorian psyche, making the sanctuary of sleep even more precious and, for some, more terrifyingly elusive. Historians still argue whether the Victorian era's intense focus on insomnia, its seemingly epidemic nature, was a unique product of its specific societal pressures, the rapid industrialization, the rigid social codes, the information explosion of its day, or if it was simply a more vocal and medically categorized articulation of a timeless human struggle, amplified by the burgeoning print media and a new medical desire to classify every ailment. What is certain is that their quest for sleep, with all its trials, errors, and occasional accidental successes, holds a mirror to our own. The allure of a quick fix, the hope invested in each new remedy, the frustration of a mind that refuses to quiet, these are experiences that transcend time. They tried everything from prayer to patent poisons, from rocking cradles for adults to electromagnetic belts. You truly have to admire their sheer commitment to finding a solution, even if their methods sometimes resembled a very sleepy, very dangerous, and occasionally explosive school science fair. Their lingering shadow is perhaps the reminder that while science and understanding evolve, the fundamental human need for restful sleep and the anxieties that arise when it deserts us remain remarkably constant. And so, our journey through the often shadowed bedrooms of the Victorian era, and their relentless, sometimes desperate, search for the solace of sleep, comes to a gentle close. We've uncovered strange contraptions, explored the perilous allure of potent potions, and considered the quiet wisdom of herbal whispers. We've seen how society grappling with immense change also grappled with the fundamental human need for rest, often with a mixture of ingenuity, misunderstanding, and sheer hope. As the gaslights dim on our historical exploration, perhaps you feel a little more connected to those who lay awake in centuries past. Their anxieties and their yearnings not so different from our own, even if their remedies often were. The quest for a good night's sleep is, after all, a timeless human endeavor. May your own pillows be comforting, your room be a true sanctuary, free from both miasmas and excessive knickknacks, and may your mind find the peace it deserves. Let the clatter of Victorian carriages fade into the soft hum of your fan, and allow the flickering gaslight to be replaced by the gentle darkness of your own restful space. There are no miracle cures here tonight, only the shared understanding that sometimes the simplest comforts are the most profound. So, as you drift now, let these stories of the past become a soft murmur, a distant echo, guiding you towards your own quiet slumber. Relax, let go, and allow the peace of this moment to envelop you completely. Sweet dreams.